Human error is an inevitable part of life, and that is no different for humans conducting executions. All throughout history, and even the present, executions have gone wrong. Sometimes it's just a little hiccup, and sometimes it's completely catastrophic. The executions in this video are definitely on the catastrophic side of the spectrum. A botched execution doesn't mean that the condemned survives, though that has happened on rare occasions. It means that there was a breakdown in the protocol, and this often results in additional suffering. This isn't just for the prisoner, but also the people bearing witness. Things can quickly become especially disturbing, grotesque, or traumatic. Here are 7 times that executions went terribly wrong. This electric chair execution went grotesquely wrong in so many ways, and the prisoner was only 14 years old. In 1944, George Stinney was thrown on trial for the murder of 2 girls in South Carolina. The only circumstantial evidence was that he was the last one seen with the girls alive. They had reportedly asked him where they could find passion flowers. There is no denying that the color of his skin was a huge factor, and it took an all-white jury less than 10 minutes to find him guilty. On June 16, 1944, George was ushered into his death chamber. The young boy only weighed 95 pounds, which was apparent by how baggy his striped jumpsuit was. His legs were too thin for the electrodes to fit, and the electric chair looked giant in comparison, and his feet didn't touch the ground. Finally, the adult-sized mask placed over his petite face was clearly not going to stay put. When asked if he had any last words, his voice quivered and cracked. "No, sir," he replied. When the switch was flipped to begin the execution, his small body shook violently, dislodging the mask. This revealed his tear-drenched, pain-riddled face and wide, blood-red eyes. He smoked and burned and writhed, filling the chamber with a pungent stench of cooking flesh. After the first round, he still wasn't dead. Another round was administered, causing his face to contort further. His eyes bulged, and it almost looked as if he was sizzling, but he was still breathing. Finally, after the 3rd round, George was pronounced dead. The largest mishap of all wasn't revealed until decades later when his guilty verdict was overturned. This botched execution took over 1 hour, resulted in a literal blood shower for the physician, and completely changed future state executions. The prisoner who endured this long and agonizing end was certainly not a good dude, but even the witnesses left tormented and faced sleepless nights. The place was Oklahoma, and day was April 29, 2014. Clayton Lockett was ushered to his death chamber at 5:21 p.m. Over the course of nearly the next hour, a paramedic and doctor failed to place an IV line after many attempts. At 6:18, the physician believed that they finally had success with a line in his groin region. A sheet was placed over it for modesty purposes, which meant that it wouldn't be monitored. European drug companies were no longer shipping barbiturates to the States for execution, so a benzodiazepine called midazolam was subbed in. This made Clayton a guinea pig. At 6:23, the midazolam dose was administered. 10 minutes later, the neuromuscular blocker designed to paralyze and halt respirations was pushed. It became obvious that Clayton was conscious. He tried to lift his head, began moaning and whimpering, and appeared to be in distress. Potassium chloride, which, if awake, feels like literal fire in your veins, was administered. This is meant to stop the heart. Clayton's struggles grew aggressive and desperate. He was writhing in agony, clearly feeling the full scope of it all. Many witnesses with even the toughest of temperaments began to tear up. One woman fled entirely, calling the display a horror movie. At 6:42, the blinds were lowered. The physician removed the sheet to see a huge bulge near the IV site. He attempted to promptly start a new line, but hit an artery and was sprayed with Clayton's blood. Eventually, it was decided to halt the execution and administer resuscitation efforts, but by the time the order made it to the chamber, Clayton was dead from cardiac arrest. From the first prick of the needle until he was pronounced dead, just under 2 hours had passed. Turns out the cocktail wasn't going straight into his vein, but into surrounding tissue, which causes a delay in efficacy and added pain. You know an execution is going terribly when the prisoner tries to take himself off of the game board by smashing his head into a pipe. Before you feel too badly for this guy, remember that he was convicted of unspeakable crimes. Jimmy Lee Gray lost the execution lottery and earned himself a ticket to the cyanide gas chamber, which is perhaps the worst of all modern methods. September 2nd, 1983 was the day to end his days. He was strapped to a chair and sealed up in his death chamber. He was also instructed to inhale deeply to speed up the matter. Once the gas began emanating, witnesses watched him gasp 11 times before he broke out in a violent struggle against his restraints. He was surely burning alive, or at least felt like it. The minutes ticked by, but he just wouldn't die. He wailed and cried and fought, making his agony apparent to those who watched. As the 7th minute turned to the 8th, he couldn't handle it anymore. His eyes likely popped by that point. He began smashing his skull into a nearby pipe, with each hit coming harder than the last. This was when witnesses were dismissed from the horror show. Jimmy allegedly eventually knocked himself out, but without the witnesses there, we will never really know exactly how it ended. Thomas Edward Ketchum, who earned the nickname Blackjack, was put on trial for an attempted train robbery in 1900. He was convicted and sentenced to death, which seems a little irrational. April 26, 1901 was the dark day in which he was meant to be put to death in Clayton, New Mexico. He was marched to the gallows to meet a fate of hanging. One thing to understand about this execution method is that there was a distinct formula to figure out the proper length of the rope to ensure that the prisoner would sustain a neck fracture upon dropping. Unfortunately, that formula was rarely done correctly. His final words were, "Goodbye, please dig my grave very deep. All right, hurry up." The floor beneath him dropped, and in a few moments he met deceleration, only something kept falling. His head. The rope was far too long, and Ketchum put on a lot of pounds in prison. This created a very large force that resulted in a complete loss of his head. After the fact, the executioner did what any dignified man would do. He took a photo of Ketchum's body and head, which later became a best-selling postcard. The longest execution in U.S. history took just under 3.5 hours, and it happened in 2022. It was a lethal injection execution in Alabama, and majority of it took place behind closed doors. It was a muggy hot July evening when Joe Nathan James Jr. was ushered to his death chamber and strapped down snugly to a gurney. Not many would argue his innocence. In '94, he smashed down the door of his ex-girlfriend's home and killed her in a jealous rage. Shockingly, her family held enough compassion for him to argue for his life to be spared. It didn't work. Starting around the 6 p.m. hour that day, Joe endured the closest thing to a death by 1,000 cuts the U.S. has ever seen. The witnesses to the execution were stuck sweating in a hot transport vehicle for hours. When they were finally allowed to take their seat before the chamber at 9 p.m., many immediately noticed that something was off. When prompted to recite his final words, Joe didn't even open his eyes or respond in any way. This remained true through the entire life-ending procedure. After the fact, the state claimed that nothing unusual had transpired, but an independently funded autopsy exam painted a grim picture. The external exam found that few areas of his body was free from assault. There were puncture marks with streaked bruising covering his knuckles, arms, legs, pelvic region, and even neck. Some of these wounds extended into the muscle, indicating either gross negligence or an intramuscular injection. This could explain his unconscious state when the execution warrant was read. Additionally, there were several incisions made that extended beyond the lowest layer of skin. The worst was in his upper arm, and it had a zigzag shape, likely a botched attempt at performing a cut-down procedure, something the state adamantly denied. This is a surgical procedure typically guided by ultrasound imaging. A scalpel is used to cut down to the vein or artery to expose it in order to place an IV catheter. The shape tells the story that Joe possibly moved due to the intense pain, causing the severely undertrained staff member to slip with the blade. Considering that the execution was due to begin at 6 p.m., that means that this treatment went on for around 3 hours. Then the actual execution took another 27 minutes. Did you know that only one firing squad execution has ever gone wrong, and it was one of the most shocking botched executions of all time? This is the story of the unfortunate end of Wallace Wilkerson. The day was May 16, 1879, and in that time, prisoners got to wear their Sunday best to their own death. He was beckoned from his cell late morning and brought to the prison yard where a crowd was waiting. He spent the day prior with his wife, who he told that he had made peace with his fate, though he maintained his innocence. Wallace was seated on a chair in the corner of the yard where he gave his final statement. "I give you my word, I intend to die like a man, looking my executioners in the eye," he said. He declined the hood so that he could do just that. A 3-inch white target was fastened to his chest over his heart, and just like that, the marshal began the countdown. 3, 2. Wallace tensed up his entire body in anticipation and terror of the number 1. Unfortunately, the target wasn't secured firmly in place. As he stiffened his chest, it moved. 4 out of 5 rifles unloaded cartridges in his arm, shattering it, and his upper torso. He spilled out of his chair onto the ground, screaming, "Oh my God, they've missed." Prison doctors rushed to him as he quickly became a groaning, bloody mess, but they were powerless to help. It was decided that the execution would not be repeated. It took 27 endless, miserable minutes for Wallace to die, and he lost any and all dignity along the way. Everyone has heard of Anne Boleyn and how she was beheaded simply because she couldn't provide the king a male heir, but Thomas Cromwell got it even worse. Some call it karma. Thomas was the king's right-hand man and helped set up plenty of wrongful executions by starting whisper campaigns and rumors. Ironically, he befell the same fate. Rumors were spread far and wide that he planned to revolt against the king he so dutifully served. A trial was bypassed because he practiced law and could possibly win exoneration. He was sent to the Tower to face beheading just like the people he set up. He pled for mercy from the king, but mercy was the last thing that he received. His executioner was a bit of a butcher, and whoopsie, someone forgot to sharpen the blade. His head was laid down on a mantle, and Thomas clenched his eyes tightly shut, hoping that it would be quick. In an instant, he felt an electrified, bloody jolt as the dull blade smashed into his neck. But he wasn't dead. Soon came another which shattered his soul with excruciating raw pounding. All it did was mangle the previous wound. His screams rang out like a wild, wicked animal. He couldn't believe his misfortune. Finally came the third, which did its job. It severed his cervical spine and his head flew from his body. Was it over? Well, studies show that the brain remains conscious for around 8 to 12 seconds after a beheading, so he still had some lingering moments to wonder about death before it arrived.